The night the world held its breath. The concert hall in Los Angeles was alive that night. Thousands of people filled every corner, their voices echoing with excitement as the lights dimmed and the music began to rise. The event was not just any gathering, it was a charity night organized to raise funds for children affected by disasters. On stage stood Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, two faces the world loved, not for their fame, but for the quiet kindness they carried wherever they went. They smiled at each other, speaking gently before stepping up to the microphone. The crowd cheered louder, camera flashes filled the air, and everything seemed perfect for a moment. But life, as always, had something unexpected waiting. As Keanu began to speak about hope and humanity, a loud sound cut through the hall. It was not from the speakers or the instruments. It was the sound of someone collapsing. At first, people thought it was just a faint whisper in the crowd, maybe a chair moving, maybe a mistake. But within seconds, the cheers turned into silence. Sandra looked toward the front rows, her eyes narrowing with concern. A young woman had fallen to the floor, her hands trembling, her body completely still. Security guards rushed forward, but Keanu was already moving. Before anyone could stop him, he jumped off the stage, landing hard on his knees, and pushed through the stunned audience. Sandra followed, her heels clicking against the stage steps as she hurried after him. The girl was no more than 20. She wore a simple white t-shirt with Keanu's movie printed on it, and her eyes fluttered weakly as she struggled for breath. Panic spread through the crowd. Cameras were still rolling, and thousands of people were watching live on social media. The noise was unbearable, people shouting, staff calling for an ambulance, flashes of light everywhere. But Keanu's voice cut through it all. Calm, steady, and filled with focus. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse, his face tightening when he realized how weak it was. Sandra took off her jacket and gently placed it under the girl's head, whispering words of comfort. No one expected them to act like doctors, yet their presence brought a sense of calm to everyone watching. The organizers tried to lead them away, but neither of them moved. Keanu asked for water and pressed the girl's wrist softly, trying to keep her conscious. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "Breathe. You're going to be fine." His voice trembled for the first time. There was something deeply human in his tone, something that reminded everyone that behind the fame, there was a heart that could feel fear too. Sandra held the girl's hand, squeezing it gently. "Help is coming," she said, even though her own voice broke halfway. The sound of sirens outside grew louder, but those few minutes felt like hours. The crowd had stopped filming. For the first time that night, silence filled the hall, broken only by the faint breathing of a frightened fan. When the medics arrived, Keanu refused to step back until they assured him she was breathing properly again. He stood there, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. Sandra placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "You did what anyone with a good heart would do," she whispered. But deep down, both of them knew that not everyone would have done what they did. Most would have stayed behind the safety of the stage, behind the cameras and lights. But Keanu had always believed that real kindness had no script, no timing, no direction. It simply happened when a soul refused to stay silent. As the girl was carried out on a stretcher, the crowd began to clap softly. It was not the loud applause of excitement, but the quiet rhythm of gratitude. People began to cry, strangers hugged each other, and something invisible passed between everyone in that room. A reminder that compassion still existed in a world often too distracted to notice. Keanu and Sandra walked slowly toward the backstage area, still shaken, their hearts heavy with worry. But before they could disappear behind the curtains, a faint voice called from behind. It was one of the medics, rushing back with urgency in his eyes. "She's asking for you," he said. Keanu stopped in his tracks. Sandra looked at him, unsure whether to go or stay. The audience watched, holding their breath again. The medic repeated softly, "She wants to see you before she's taken to the hospital." Without a word, Keanu turned and began walking toward the ambulance, Sandra right beside him. The cameras followed them through the night air, the flashing red lights painting their faces in streaks of fear and hope. The young woman, pale and weak, tried to lift her hand when she saw them approaching. Her lips moved, but the sound was barely there. Sandra knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're okay now," she whispered. The girl smiled faintly and looked up at Keanu with eyes full of tears. I waited my whole life to meet you, she said weakly, her voice fading with every word. And now you saved me. The air grew still again. Keanu froze, unable to speak. A tear rolled down his cheek as he gently touched her hand. No, he said softly, you saved us. By reminding us what matters most. His words broke something inside everyone who heard them. Sandra closed her eyes, overwhelmed by emotion, while people around them began to cry openly. The ambulance doors closed slowly, and the sirens came alive once more, fading into the distance as they drove away into the night. Keanu and Sandra stood in silence, their faces illuminated by the last flash of red light disappearing down the street. Back inside the hall, the event was supposed to continue, but nobody wanted music anymore. The audience stayed quiet, waiting for an announcement, unsure of what would happen next. Keanu returned to the stage, his steps heavy but steady. Sandra followed, standing slightly behind him, her eyes red but proud. He took the microphone again, his voice softer now. Tonight wasn't about fame or movies, he said slowly. It was about remembering that every heartbeat in this room matters. Let's not forget that. The crowd stood in respect. There were no cheers this time, no camera flashes, just thousands of people standing together, connected by a moment they would never forget. As they walked off the stage later that night, Sandra noticed Keanu staring at the floor, lost in thought. Are you okay? She asked gently. He nodded, but his eyes told a different story. I just keep thinking, he whispered. What if we hadn't noticed her in time? Sandra touched his arm softly. But you did, she said. And maybe that was meant to happen. Keanu looked at her, his expression unreadable. But something in his heart shifted quietly. A feeling that this moment was not over yet. That something about that young fan would return to change their lives in a way neither of them could imagine. And as the night ended, the city lights flickered outside, unaware that a single act of compassion had already begun a story that would reach far beyond that stage. The visit that changed everything, the morning after the charity event, Los Angeles felt strangely quiet. The newspapers were full of pictures of Keanu and Sandra kneeling beside the fainted fan, their faces lit by ambulance lights. The internet called it the most human moment in Hollywood. Messages of love and concern poured in from every corner of the world, but none of that mattered to Keanu. All night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's pale face and the fragile way her hand had reached for his. He kept thinking about her words. You saved me. Something inside him wouldn't rest until he knew if she was truly okay. By sunrise, Sandra called him. She sounded tired but determined. I checked with the hospital, she said softly. She's stable now, but still weak. Maybe we should go see her. Keanu didn't hesitate. Within an hour, they were both in a quiet corner of St. Vincent Medical Center, dressed simply, trying to avoid attention. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and fear. Doctors passed by with unreadable faces, and every step echoed with the weight of uncertainty. When they reached the room, a nurse recognized them instantly, her eyes wide with surprise. She's been asking if you'd come, she whispered. She hasn't stopped talking about that night. The girl lay on the bed, her skin still pale but her smile alive. Her parents stood nearby, eyes red from crying but full of gratitude. When Keanu and Sandra entered, she tried to sit up, but Keanu gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Don't move, he said softly. We just wanted to see how you're feeling. She looked at him, tears gathering in her eyes. I didn't mean to scare everyone, she whispered. I've been sick for months, but I didn't want to miss that night. I just wanted to see you both in person before... Her voice cracked before she could finish. Sandra knelt beside her bed, holding her hand. Before what, sweetheart? She asked quietly. The girl hesitated, then took a slow breath. Before my surgery, she said. I have a heart condition. It's rare. The doctors say they'll try again next week, but... It's risky. The words hit Keanu like a wave. His throat tightened, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. He thought of all the people who looked up to him, who saw strength in his calmness. But in that moment, he felt small and helpless. Her name was Lily. She was 21 and studying literature. She had dreamed of being a writer, of telling stories about kindness and courage. Her mother explained that Lily had written letters to Keanu for years but never sent them. She admired not his fame, but his humility, the way he treated strangers like equals. "When I fainted," Lily said weakly, "I thought that was the end. But when I opened my eyes and saw you both there, I felt peace. It was like life was giving me one more chance." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "Lily," she said gently, "you gave us something too. You reminded us what real courage looks like." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze soft but intense. "You kept fighting to be here," he said. "That's more powerful than anything we could ever do on a stage." For a while, the room stayed quiet except for the rhythmic beep of the monitor. Then Lily's father cleared his throat. "We can't afford the full treatment," he said hesitantly. "The foundation is helping, but it's complicated." He stopped when he noticed Keanu's expression. There was no hesitation in Keanu's eyes, no calculation, only quiet resolve. "We'll take care of it," he said simply. "No one should lose a chance to live because of money." Sandra turned to him, startled but proud. "We'll both help," she added softly. Lily began to cry again, covering her face with her trembling hands. As the day went on, they stayed longer than planned. Keanu read a few pages from a book by her bedside, his voice gentle and steady. Sandra told stories from their early movie days, making Lily laugh so hard her heart monitor beeped faster. Even the nurses peeked in, smiling quietly, touched by the scene unfolding in that small white room. When evening came, Keanu promised to visit again before her surgery. As they left, Lily whispered, "If I make it through, I'll write something for you both, a story about that night." Outside the hospital, the city lights began to shimmer against the dusky sky. Sandra looked at Keanu as they walked toward the car. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't just save her that night. She's saving you too." Keanu frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. Sandra smiled sadly. "You've spent years helping others quietly but never letting anyone help you. Maybe she's the one who'll remind you that you still have healing to do too." Keanu didn't answer. He looked out toward the fading sun, his mind replaying Lily's words again and again. That night, he sat alone on his balcony, the city far below, his thoughts heavy. For years, he had carried invisible grief, loss, pain, loneliness hidden beneath calm smiles. But something about Lily's courage lit a small fire inside him again. He thought of how fragile life was, how moments could change everything. He didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that Lily's story would soon reach millions, and that her next act would challenge everything he believed about fate, hope, and what it truly means to save a life. And as the moon rose over Los Angeles, Keanu whispered to the wind, "Please, let her live." But somewhere in the quiet corridors of St. Vincent Hospital, a new complication was already forming, one that would test the strength of every promise made that day. The letter before surgery 3 days passed, and the hospital room had turned into a place of quiet strength. Lilies stood in a vase by the window, their fragrance mixing with the sharp scent of medicine. Lily's face was brighter now, her laugh returning in small moments when Keanu or Sandra visited. Every day they brought something simple, a book, a smile, a story. Keanu read to her from her favorite novel, and sometimes she fell asleep mid-sentence, her head tilting slightly, the monitor softly beeping beside her. Sandra made sure she ate, telling her about old film sets, making her giggle when she imitated directors. Yet beneath all the laughter, a shadow of fear lingered. The surgery was approaching, and no one could predict the outcome. The night before the operation, the hospital felt heavier than usual. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Keanu had promised to visit again before midnight, but traffic kept him delayed. Sandra had already stopped by earlier, leaving a small card on Lily's bedside table, a handwritten note with 3 words, "You are light." Lily stared at it now, holding it close to her heart. She knew the risks. She had read enough about her condition to understand that this surgery was not just a routine procedure. There was a chance she might not wake up again. When Keanu finally arrived, his clothes were damp, his hair messy from the rain. He looked tired, but still smiled when he saw her awake. "You should be resting," he said quietly. "I wanted to wait for you," she replied. "I wrote something." She handed him a folded letter, her handwriting soft and shaky. "Read it after the surgery," she whispered. "If I don't—" She stopped herself, forcing a smile instead. Keanu's heart sank. He didn't want to think about if. He wanted to believe that she would walk out of this hospital, healthy, smiling, maybe even writing that book she had always dreamed about. He sat beside her, holding the letter carefully. "You'll tell me what it says yourself," he said gently. "That's a promise." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Promise me something too," she said softly. "If I don't wake up, don't let them remember me as just the fan who fainted. Tell them I was happy. Tell them I wasn't afraid." Keanu blinked back tears, shaking his head. "Don't talk like that," he whispered. "You're strong, Lily. Stronger than you know." For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the rain. Keanu told her stories from his childhood, about growing up without much, about losing people he loved, and how he found peace in small acts of kindness. Lily listened quietly, her eyes following every movement of his face. "You know," she said, "that's why I admire you. You turned pain into purpose." Keanu looked away, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes," he said, "the pain just hides deeper." Lily reached out weakly and touched his hand. "Then maybe let someone else carry it for a while," she whispered. The nurse came in, reminding them it was late. Keanu stood, reluctant to leave. "I'll be here in the morning," he promised. Lily smiled softly. "Then I'll hold on till then." When he left the room, he paused by the door, looking back one last time. She waved, small and fragile, but her eyes were steady. Back home, he placed the letter on his bedside table, untouched. The rain outside grew heavier, thunder rumbling in the distance. Sleep wouldn't come. He kept thinking about her courage, her smile, the calm way she accepted the unknown. He realized something had changed in him. He had spent years helping others, yet he had kept his own pain locked away. Somehow, this young woman with a failing heart had opened his again. The next morning, Keanu and Sandra arrived early, waiting outside the operation room. Lily was already being prepared, her parents holding each other tightly. Before being wheeled in, she turned her head and saw them. "Don't forget," she said weakly. "Read my letter after." Keanu nodded, his throat too tight for words. Hours passed. The red light above the operating room stayed on. Nurses moved in and out, faces tense, eyes avoiding the waiting families. Sandra paced the hallway, whispering quiet prayers. Keanu sat still, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. Every minute felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, alarms blared inside. A nurse rushed past, shouting for assistance. Keanu's heart dropped. He stood, frozen, as the doors swung open briefly, just long enough for him to see doctors surrounding Lily's bed, their hands moving quickly, voices sharp with urgency. Sandra grabbed his arm. "Stay here," she said firmly, though her voice shook. The doors closed again, locking them out. Time lost all meaning. When the alarms finally stopped, the hallway went silent. A doctor stepped out, his face unreadable. Keanu rose, his entire body trembling. "Please," he whispered, "tell me she's okay." The doctor sighed, lowering his eyes. "She's alive," he said, "but it was close. She lost a lot of blood. We managed to stabilize her, but the next 24 hours are critical." Keanu's legs nearly gave out from relief. Sandra let out a shaky breath, whispering, "Thank God." They watched through the small glass window as Lily was wheeled into recovery, her body weak but alive. That night, Keanu returned home again, exhausted yet hopeful. He sat by the window, looking at the city lights, and finally reached for the letter. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. "Dear Keanu, if you're reading this, it means the surgery happened, and I hope I made it through. But if I didn't, please know that meeting you and Sandra gave me the greatest peace I've ever known. I spent years watching you remind people to be kind, and I wanted to do the same, even if in small ways. So I donated everything I could to the charity that night, the one for the children. All of it was in my name, but it was meant to be from you. I wanted to give back what your kindness gave me, hope, Thank you for seeing me. Not as a fan, but as a person. You made me feel real. Keanu put the letter down, unable to hold back his tears. Her words cut through him deeper than anything fame had ever brought. She had given away what little she had, just to spread the kindness she saw in him. And now, as he looked out at the sleeping city, he realized that Lily's story wasn't just about survival. It was about legacy. But far away, in the dim recovery room, Lily's heart monitor began to flicker again. The nurse rushed in, shouting for help. And just like that, the quiet night turned into another storm. The truth she never told the following morning was quiet, yet a strange heaviness filled the hospital corridors. The kind of silence that made every sound sharper, every heartbeat louder. Keanu and Sandra arrived early again, carrying a small bouquet of white tulips, Lily's favorite flowers. The nurse at the reception hesitated when she saw them. "She's stable," she said slowly. "But the doctor wants to speak with you first." Those few words sent a wave of unease through them. Keanu exchanged a tense glance with Sandra before they followed the nurse down the narrow hall, where the doctor waited near the glass doors of the intensive care unit. Inside, machines surrounded Lily's bed. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling weakly beneath a thin hospital blanket. She looked peaceful but fragile, like someone caught between two worlds. The doctor cleared his throat softly. "She's holding on," he said, "but her heart suffered more damage than we expected. There's something else, too. Something we found in her records." Keanu frowned. "What do you mean?" The doctor sighed. "She's been delaying her surgery for months. She could have done it earlier, but she didn't have the funds. And from what I read, she refused donations. She kept saying she didn't want to take money from people who needed it more." Keanu's chest tightened. He remembered her saying she wanted to help others, even when she was the one suffering. That was Lily, selfless to the end. But the doctor wasn't finished. "There's another detail," he continued quietly. "Someone had been covering part of her hospital bills anonymously for the last 2 years. No one knows who it was. The name on the payments was listed as Air." He handed Keanu a printed page with the details. Keanu stared at it for a moment before shaking his head. "She never mentioned anyone by that name," he murmured. Sandra leaned closer, reading the letters. She repeated softly. "Maybe a friend?" As they stood there, a soft knock came from behind. It was Lily's mother, her eyes red from exhaustion. "There's something you should see," she whispered, motioning for them to follow her to the family room. Inside, she pulled out a small wooden box from her purse and opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of letters, all unopened, all addressed to Lily. Keanu picked one up gently. The handwriting was familiar, neat, thoughtful, almost artistic. Sandra read the return address aloud. A.R. Arthur Reeves, San Francisco. Keanu froze. That surname hit him like lightning. "Reeves," he whispered. "That's my father's name." For a moment, nobody spoke. Keanu's father had left when he was very young, disappearing from his life entirely. He had spent decades trying to make peace with that loss, convincing himself it didn't matter anymore. But now, seeing those initials, those letters, it felt as if fate had been weaving a quiet connection all along. Lily's mother nodded slowly. "Lily used to receive those letters years ago," she said. "She never told us who they were from. She said the writer was someone who helped her mother once, someone who cared about people he never met." Keanu felt the ground shift beneath him. Could it be possible? Could the man who abandoned him have been helping this girl? He opened one of the letters, his hands trembling. Inside was a simple message written in soft ink. "Dear Lily, I know your mother struggles, but please don't lose hope. I can't give you my name, but I promise to help quietly until you're strong again. Remember this. Kindness doesn't always come face to face. Sometimes it works in silence." Keanu closed his eyes. The handwriting matched old notes he had once seen from his father, back when he was still a boy. His heart ached with a strange mixture of grief and wonder. It was as if the man who once walked out of his life had somehow found redemption through another, through Lily. "This doesn't make sense," Sandra whispered. "Are you saying your father helped her family?" Keanu nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I think he did. And she never knew who he really was." As they spoke, a nurse appeared at the door, panic in her eyes. "She's awake," she said quickly, "but she's asking for you." Keanu rushed back to the room, his mind spinning with questions. When he entered, Lily turned her head weakly toward him. Her voice was faint but steady. "You came," she whispered. "I didn't want to leave without saying thank you." He smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You're not leaving," he said. "You're fighting." She tried to smile, but tears slipped down her cheeks. "The doctor told me," she whispered. "They found something. The letters. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was afraid." Keanu pulled a chair closer, leaning in. "You knew him?" he asked gently. Lily nodded weakly. "Yes," she said. "The man who helped us, his name was Arthur. He said he once made mistakes he could never fix, but he wanted to make things right by helping others quietly. I didn't know he was connected to you until I saw your last name on the event flyer months ago." Her words trembled, her breathing shallow. "I thought it was a sign. Maybe meeting you was meant to complete something he started." Keanu felt his throat tighten. "Arthur Reeves," he whispered. "He was my father." The room fell silent. Lily's lips parted in surprise, her eyes widening as tears filled them again. "Then it's true," she breathed. "He said he wished one day his son would forgive him. Maybe this was his way, connecting us." Keanu's heart ached. Years of anger, confusion, and silence collapsed under the weight of her words. He took her hand gently. "You already gave him forgiveness," he said softly. "And maybe you gave me mine too." The monitor beeped steadily, the sound filling the small room. Sandra stood quietly in the corner, tears glistening in her eyes. Outside, the evening sun poured golden light through the window, touching Lily's face softly. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering, "Then maybe everything that happened was never an accident." But just as Keanu started to respond, the monitor began to flicker again. Her breathing grew shallow, the lines on the screen shifting wildly. Nurses rushed in, calling for the doctor. Keanu stepped back, his heart pounding. "Stay with us, Lily," he said desperately. But her body went still, her eyes half open as if caught between sleep and peace. The doctor shouted orders, the team working furiously, but Keanu could only watch in helpless silence. Sandra held his arm, tears streaming down her face. The world outside continued to move, cars passing, lights glowing, but inside that room, time stopped. Then, after what felt like eternity, the sound returned. The monitor beeped again, faint but alive. She had come back. Barely conscious, Lily opened her eyes and whispered something so quiet only Keanu could hear. "Tell them! Kindness doesn't end." And then she closed her eyes again, drifting into a deep, fragile sleep. Keanu stood there frozen, her words echoing in his heart. Somewhere he felt that his father's spirit was finally at peace, that through Lily, something broken had been healed. But he also knew this wasn't the end. There was still something left unfinished, a promise that needed to be kept. Outside the hospital, night fell slowly, and the world moved on, unaware that inside one small room, two souls had just rewritten the meaning of forgiveness and love. The promise lives on. The hospital walls had grown familiar now, almost like a second home to Keanu. Days blended into nights, and nights into silent waiting. Lily was alive, but her condition was uncertain. The doctors called it a fragile balance, and every beep of the monitor became a prayer. Sandra came daily, sometimes with food, sometimes with only her quiet presence. There were no cameras anymore, no headlines, no noise from the outside world. What remained was human, raw, honest, and fragile. Keanu spent most nights by the window of her room, watching the city lights fade into dawn. He rarely spoke, but his mind never stopped turning. The revelation about his father still echoed inside him, like a whisper he couldn't escape. He kept replaying Lily's words. Maybe this was his way of connecting us. It felt like fate had drawn a circle he never knew existed, one that began with his father's regret and ended in this hospital room. One morning, as the sun rose behind pale clouds, Lily stirred. Her voice was weak, but her eyes opened fully for the first time in days. "You're still here," she said softly. Keanu smiled faintly. I told you I would be. She blinked slowly, studying his tired face. You haven't slept. He shook his head. I couldn't. I was afraid you'd wake up and I'd miss it. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a breath. Then it's my turn to keep you awake, she whispered. For a while, they sat in quiet conversation. Lily spoke of her dreams, how she wanted to publish a book, not for fame, but to remind people that kindness had power. I want it to be called The Promise of Light, she said softly, because every time someone is kind, they pass that light forward. It never dies. Keanu listened, his eyes glistening. Then let's make it happen, he said. We'll help you publish it. Every word you write will carry your heart. Her lips trembled. But what if I don't finish it? She asked. Then I will, Keanu replied quietly. And I'll make sure the world hears your voice. Sandra, standing by the door, turned away to wipe her tears. She had seen kindness in many forms before. Charity events, donations, public speeches. But this was different. This was love born from pain, not pity. Days passed, and Lily began to write again, her shaky hand clutching a pen. Keanu brought her notebooks, and Sandra decorated them with small sketches of stars and tulips. Each page held a piece of her heart. She wrote about strangers who smiled on bad days, about children who shared their food, about people who stayed when others walked away. Her words were soft but powerful, reflections of a soul that had seen both darkness and grace. One evening, as Keanu read her latest entry aloud, Lily stopped him. I have a wish, she said. When I'm gone, if that happens, don't let people remember me for fainting or suffering. Tell them to remember that even when life hurts, you can still choose to be kind. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone bright. Promise me that. Keanu nodded slowly, his voice breaking. I promise. After that, things changed. Keanu began working quietly behind the scenes. He reached out to organizations, writers, and teachers, forming a small foundation called The Promise of Light. Sandra helped design its vision, to fund stories, books, and art created by people who had lived through pain, yet chose compassion over bitterness. It's not about saving everyone, Sandra said once. It's about reminding the world that kindness is still a choice. As news of the foundation spread, people began sending letters from small towns, schools, and hospitals. Survivors, teachers, orphans, and strangers wrote about how Lily's story touched them. Social media filled with the hashtag #OurPromiseOfLight. Even those who had never met her began to carry candles in silent vigils across cities. A single act of compassion on stage had turned into a wave of hope across continents. But in the middle of this growing movement, Keanu's heart remained heavy. He couldn't celebrate while Lily's future was still uncertain. Every evening, he returned to her bedside, reading aloud the messages people sent. One night, he read a letter from a little boy in India who had donated his lunch money to help another child in school. Lily smiled faintly. That's what I wanted, she whispered. To make the world softer. Keanu leaned closer. You already have, he said. A week later, the doctor came with cautious optimism. She's responding better than expected, he said. Her heart is weak but healing. She'll need months of recovery, maybe more. Keanu exhaled deeply for the first time in days. Sandra hugged him tightly, whispering, She's coming back. As weeks turned into months, the hospital room became a meeting place of strangers turned friends. Musicians came to sing softly by her window. Children from charities sent drawings. Volunteers brought flowers and notes. Each person carried a story connected to her kindness. Lily's name became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of transformation. Then one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lily handed Keanu a notebook. It's done, she said weakly. The book? He asked, surprised. She nodded slowly. The last chapter is yours. Write about what you saw, what you felt. I want it to end with your voice, not mine. Keanu stared at her, his throat tightening. Why me? He asked. She smiled gently. Because you lived through pain, too. And now you know that kindness can heal it. That night, as she slept, Keanu opened the notebook and began to write. His words flowed like a confession about loss, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways love finds its way back. He wrote until dawn, his tears falling silently onto the paper. When he finished, he looked at the sleeping girl who had changed his world and whispered, "You kept your promise, Lily." But fate, unpredictable as ever, wasn't done with them yet. A few days later, during a small press conference about the foundation, Keanu's phone rang. It was the hospital. The tone of the nurse's voice made his hands shake before she even said the words. "You need to come now," she whispered. "It's about Lily." He dropped everything, the microphones, the lights, the noise, and ran, and as he raced through the corridors toward her room once more, the echoes of his footsteps sounded like a heartbeat caught between fear and faith. The light that never fades, Keanu reached the hospital in minutes, his heart pounding louder than the rain slamming against the streets. He ran past nurses calling his name, through hallways that had become too familiar until he reached Lily's room. Sandra was already there, her face pale, tears glistening in her eyes. The machines beside the bed beeped in uneven rhythms, their sounds sharp and unsteady. Lily's body looked smaller than ever, her skin faintly luminous under the dim fluorescent light. A doctor stood nearby, speaking softly. Her heart began to fail again. "We're trying everything we can." Keanu froze at the doorway, unable to move. This couldn't be happening, not after all she had survived. He walked to her slowly, each step heavier than the last. Sandra took his hand, squeezing it hard, grounding him in a moment that felt like a dream slipping away. He knelt beside Lily's bed, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Hey, you promised you'd finish the book." She opened her eyes weakly, barely able to focus, yet when she saw him, a faint smile formed. "You finished it," she whispered. "You kept your word." Her breathing grew shallower. The doctor signaled the nurses, but Keanu didn't move away. He held her trembling hand, tears falling freely now. "Stay with us, Lily," he murmured, his voice cracking. "You have so much left to do." She looked at him, her lips barely moving. "It's okay," she whispered. "You'll carry it now." That's how light works. It passes on. Her words drifted into the air like a final prayer. Keanu felt her fingers grow lighter in his grasp, and then, still, the machine's steady beeping turned into one long, hollow tone. The nurses moved quickly, voices urgent. But Keanu didn't hear them. All he could feel was silence, the kind that cuts through the soul. Sandra covered her mouth, sobbing quietly as doctors tried to revive her. Minutes passed. The sound of the rain outside grew louder. And then, at last, the doctor stopped. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "She's gone." Keanu sat motionless, his hand still holding hers. In that stillness, memories flooded him. Her laughter, her courage, her dreams. He thought of how she had turned pain into something beautiful, how she had taken a moment of fear on a stage and turned it into a movement that touched millions. Sandra knelt beside him, wrapping her arm around his shoulders, whispering through tears. "She changed the world, Keanu, and she did it through love." The funeral was held a week later on a quiet hill overlooking the city. Hundreds of people came. Doctors, students, children from charities, even strangers who had read her story online. White tulips covered the ground. Keanu stood silently before the small wooden casket, holding her notebook, the promise of light. Sandra stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "She taught us that kindness doesn't end when a heartbeat does. It continues through every life it touches. Lily showed me what true courage looks like. Not the kind that stands in front of cameras, but the kind that fights quietly, even when no one's watching. She reminded me that compassion is not a gesture, it's a legacy." He paused, his eyes glancing toward the sky, where clouds slowly broke apart, letting sunlight stream through. "She once told me that light passes on," he said softly. "And today I believe it." After the ceremony, the Promise of Light Foundation grew beyond anything they had imagined. Schools began teaching Lily's story to children. Her book, published posthumously with Keanu's final chapter, became a global symbol of hope. It wasn't just a book, it was a movement. every sale-funded hospital care for children who couldn't afford treatment. Her words, "choose kindness even when it hurts," became a phrase whispered across countries, written on murals, printed on posters, and carried in the hearts of those who read them. Months later, Keanu visited a small library built in her name. It stood quietly beside a children's hospital, sunlight spilling across its glass windows. A plaque near the entrance read, "This place exists because one girl believed that kindness could outlive her." Inside, children read her stories aloud, their voices bright and full of life. Sandra joined him there, smiling softly as she watched. "She'd be proud," she whispered. Keanu nodded, his eyes glistening. "She is." As he walked to the window, he noticed something on the wall, one of Lily's last letters, framed in glass. The handwriting was faint but clear. "Dear Keanu, if you're reading this, I hope you smile. Don't carry sadness for too long. Use it to build something kind. Tell them kindness isn't about big moments. It's about small choices again and again. I'll always believe that somewhere, light finds light." He touched the glass gently, his reflection merging with her words. For the first time in years, his heart felt both heavy and whole. He stepped outside, the wind brushing softly against his face, and looked toward the setting sun. The city shimmered with golden light, and for a moment, everything felt connected. His father's redemption, Lily's courage, and the endless chain of kindness that now reached far beyond them. Sandra stood beside him quietly, and he turned to her with a small smile. "You know," he said, "I used to think fame gave life meaning. Now I know it's what we give away that keeps us alive." Sandra smiled through her tears. "That's what she wanted you to learn." They stood there until the last rays of sunlight faded, their hearts full, their silence peaceful. And as night settled over the city, a candlelight vigil began near the library gates. Hundreds of people gathered, holding small flames in their hands, tiny lights flickering together in the dark, one by one. Voices began to whisper her words. Kindness doesn't end. And in that glow, somewhere in the quiet wind, it felt as though Lily's voice whispered back, "It never will."